In Satisfactory, you can create lots of different items. One of the most hated items in the game is screws. Players will often search for alternate recipes that don't use screws because of the ridiculous number of screws that can be required. So let's figure out the most number of screws that can be made in the Satisfactory world. I've created a template here to figure out what the best method will be. It starts off with the iron recipes. I've got iron ingots going into rods, then screws. I've also got some more iron ingots going directly into cast screws. Both of these recipes have a ratio of 1 iron ingot into 4 screws. After creating this, I realised that there are different stages to this depending on what recipes I use. If using iron ingots, I can use the alternate recipes to create this, and the best one is the basic iron ingot, combining iron ore and limestone, followed by the iron alloy ingot, which uses copper ore instead of limestone, and then the water recipe. The other way of making screws is from steel beams, but there are several ways of making steel ingots. There's a normal recipe, the solid steel recipe that uses iron ingots, the coke steel ingot that uses petroleum coke, the compacted steel ingot which uses compacted coal. I'm not going to be able to use all of the coal in the most effective recipe because of the other prerequisites. The best one to use is a compacted coal recipe because one coal can be made into 4 steel ingots. It does use sulfur and iron ore. I'm not too worried about the iron ore because there is less sulfur than coal. Following this is the solid steel recipe to use up the rest of the coal, which is 2 coal to 3 steel ingots. The coke steel recipe is slightly better, but I don't want to use up the iron creating this, so I thought it would be best to focus on the solid steel recipe, then I'll use the coke steel recipe. If I have any iron left over, then I'll use it to make cast screws. Obviously any iron ingot I create here will be using an alternate recipe. All of these make steel ingots, which I then need to make into steel beams. The steel screw recipe is 1 beam for 52 screws. For the beams, it is 4 ingots into 1 beam. However, there is the moulded beam recipe, which is 2.6 reoccurring ingots into 1 beam, so you get slightly more. It does use concrete, but I'm sure there'll be enough limestone for that, even with alternate recipes. If not, I can use the rest of the ingots to make standard beams. Finally, separate to all of those, is the aluminium beam recipe. I'll be able to use alternate recipes to make the aluminium ingots, but that goes straight into beams, which will then be used in the steel screw recipe. First of all, I need to start with some blueprints. I've got a blueprint mod here that's giving me a 22 by 22 blueprint designer, and I can use that to create some very long belt pathways. I've also got another mod that means that the belts and pipes and whatever else will automatically connect. I don't have to try and put another little belt down to get everything to connect. The first thing I needed to do though was create a very big platform, which I was able to do with another mod that allowed me to create huge zooping platforms, which I could have used in the video I did about covering the whole world. The first recipe that I was going to use is the compacted coal recipe, which is equal parts coal, equal parts sulfur, being made into equal parts compacted coal. So I had to get all of the sulfur in from across the world, and there's a lot of it. There is really a lot. The sulfur is all around the map, so I had to create these very long single tile foundations, and you can see here I'm moving quite a distance with the mod. I'm able to fly around with the advanced game settings. I have also sped time up a bit because otherwise it's going to take a very long time to get some of this done. I've made my way over to the very first sulfur node, and I'm putting down a miner Mark III, and I'm putting power shards in them to get as much as possible as I can from them. Using the blueprint I created earlier and the mod that automatically means that belts are connected, I could create these 22 long belts and work my way across the map very quickly. I've now worked my way over to the second sulfur node, and not all the sulfur are pure. Some of them will be normal, so they'll only give 600 sulfur instead of 1200. So this node is a normal node, so I need to combine it with another normal node to fully max out one of those Mark 6 belts. Before going any further, I realised it was probably a good idea to put some radar towers down, because yes, I can use the Satisfactory calculator map to find where everything is, and I can use the in-game scanner to find where all of the sulfur is, but I realise it's probably easier just to be able to see it on the map without me having to do any searching. Anyway, with the radar towers done, I can get back to getting all of the sulfur over to this main platform that I created above the southern grass plains. It takes a surprising amount of time to get all of these resources in to where you need them, but I did eventually get there. Because the sulfur is not near the grass plains, I realised it was probably a good idea to build a single big belt highway that goes across a sort of central part of the map, and then I can just attach the sulfur to it to bring it to where I need it. And this is the sulfur all done. So it starts from the very northern part of the dunes. I've got it going over the Spire coast, and then down here to the central parts, and there's little bits coming in at the sides, but it's gradually filling up the belt. And one thing that happened was, with some of these long belts, sometimes you wouldn't see the sulfur on it. I think it's not too bad now, but it certainly happens later on. And it's just a graphical glitch. So, and here's the other two belts from the other side. So this is all the sulfur where I need it, which took a surprising amount of time. I did not realise it would take this long. There is 10,800 sulfur in the whole of the map, and for the compacted coal recipe I need another 10,800 coal to combine with it, and so that's what I'm getting here. And I'm starting off in the grass plains because then I don't have to take it so far. Here is enough coal, 10,800 of it, and so next step is to get it combined in assemblers to make the compacted coal. So I'm building a very big setup here because a blueprint designer in the normal world is only 6x6, and you could probably only fit about 4 or 5 assemblers in, but I can fit, I don't know how many it is here, but a good 15, so it makes it a lot easier. So while I've created 15 assemblers, I realised that to be able to put down an equal number of blueprints without having to remove anything more, that it would probably be better trying to figure out the exact number I need and then go from there. So I've got 12 assemblers now, and that will work well for the amount of assemblers I need in total. Here are 9 belts with 10,800 sulfur and coal being made into 10,800 compacted coal. And this is all the sulfur in the world being used. There is now no other way to get sulfur unless I were to use SAM ore recipes, but I use that for something else later on. This isn't all of the coal. There is still a fair bit that I can use, but it's definitely a good chunk of it. I've got a blueprint here to make compacted coal into steel. The original recipe for steel is 3 iron ore and 3 coal into 3 steel ingots, but with the compacted coal recipe it is 1 compacted coal and 2 iron ore being made into 4 steel. So already there I'm getting quite a bit more steel from the resources that I put in. There was a mod earlier that I was talking about where splitters and mergers can automatically connect to belts when you use blueprints, and it was really useful in cases like this because now the coal, well, compacted coal, is being fed all the way through to the end, and so it doesn't matter how many blueprints I've got, I will just have it all automatically connect without me having to do anything. Once all the blueprints are put down for the compacted coal, it's time to get the iron up. Now each row is 1,200 compacted coal but would require 2,400 iron, so I need double the amount. About halfway through the row of foundries I've got another way in for iron, so that I can make sure I've got plenty of iron going in. However, when I was creating all of this, I then realised that I need to build a bit more vertically because I was running out of space for starters, but also it would just be a lot quicker if I could just put down plenty of towers of blueprints rather than one huge row. I thought about giving it a bit of colour here, but doing the colour just ended up making things a bit worse. You can see some foundations on the very right there that I'd accidentally made this carbon steel colour, and it took a while to try and undo all of that. I really shouldn't have done it. One thing I had to do as well was to create a tower of splitters connected by conveyor lifts so that I could get all of the compacted coal and iron reaching all the different levels. If I didn't do this, and I didn't save it as part of a blueprint, then I would have had to have done this 9 times, and trying to get the exact same thing each time would have been a bit tricky. So I did it at least just to use for one lot of blueprints, and then had a version of this without this tower that I could use for the rest of the blueprints. I deleted the foundry blueprints I had before for the compacted coal and put down these different blueprints that are the towers that I created earlier. From here on out, I realised that doing these tower versions of blueprints was so much better. It was a lot quicker, I was able to get more in. It was definitely the right decision to do. Finally done. This is all of the sulfur in the world being made into steel ingots via the compacted coal recipe, and so in total there are 43,200 steel ingots being created. This next section was a bit of a mistake, so I needed to create a whole bunch of concrete to mix with the steel ingots to make steel beams. You could do this in different ways. You could get the limestone, just convert it directly into concrete. You can mix it with rubber, water or silica. By using the rubber recipe, you get the most concrete out of the limestone possible. Problem is, you are using a lot of the oil that could be used to make petroleum coke, and that could then in turn be used to make the steel beams a different way. So this is where it got quite tricky, trying to figure out the maths of how much you use of one resource in comparison to another resource. So I spent a good few sessions sorting out this rubber, only to then scrap it all and use a different method. After getting frustrated with my mistake, I thought, let's just get a whole bunch of limestone in so it's there ready for me to use when I need to. To make the concrete, I chose the silica recipe. So for every 24 limestone you put in, you get 20 concrete. With the water version, the pure concrete version, it's every 24 limestone you put in, you only get 18 concrete. So it's a very small difference, but when you're creating a large scale project like this, it's probably best to do it this way. Plus, I couldn't see any other use for the quartz. I know the water is an infinite resource, but the quartz wasn't being used for anything else, and sometimes just using solid products rather than water in pipes actually just made it a bit easier to manage. So now I've got here all of the quartz being made into silica, and all of that combining with limestone to make even more concrete. Now it's time to get all of the steel over to combine with the concrete. Once again, I created these blueprints to start off getting them into a sort of belt highway. Definitely very useful to do. It definitely made things a lot easier. I then put down these belt highways to connect everything up, and it was definitely a lot easier to do it this way. You can see there a bit of lag, and I thought initially it was because of the colour of the belts, but I had taken that off later on and made it a default colour, and there was still lag, so I'm assuming it's just because of the sheer amount of buildings and belts and all of that I had on the map. Now finally I can get the steel put into the blueprints to combine with the concrete and to eventually make steel beams. I'm very glad I got the mod that allows for different mark versions of the machines, because otherwise I would have had huge rows of the foundries creating these steel beams. Each belt isn't quite 1,200, it's a little bit less, but it's still a heck of a lot of steel beams. Now it's time to make those steel beams into screws. So there's different recipes for screws. You either have the normal recipes, which is iron rods into screws. There's the cast screw one, which is very useful. It's just iron ingots straight into screws. The final alternate recipe for the screws is steel beams being made directly into screws. So normally it would be one steel beam being made into 52 screws. Because I'm using a mod that uses different Mark versions of the machines, I can have a constructor Mark IV down that uses 20 steel beams per minute being made into 1040 screws. So that then means that's near enough one full Mark VI belt going directly into an awesome sink. Putting these downs definitely created a bit of lag, and as the game went on the lag got a little bit worse, so I had to be very patient with how I put down these blueprints. Finally I can get these belts of steel beams being made directly into screws and get that sunk. This is now the final product of making as many screws as possible from Sulfur. So I've got all the belts going in, I've got all of the constructors. These are just the normal constructors. Could have had 4 times less if I used that machine mod. These machines here, the foundries, I think these are also the normal ones. These aren't the foundries Mark IV, whichever version it went up to. And you can see just on the side here this tower of conveyor lifts. That's the second lot of iron going in, because I needed 2,400 per row. And I finally got all of these steel ingots coming over, probably causing the frame rate to go a bit funny there, the bit rate as well. Got quartz being made into silica, which then comes back out and combined with the limestone into concrete, which combines with the steel ingots to make steel beams. And you can see the gaps there showing that the belt isn't quite completely full. I went over the maths so many times here, and so I'm pretty sure I've got it to be as 100% accurate as possible, and it certainly meant that this area became a little bit laggy when I came back to later. I think even at times the game crashed when I came to this area, so I had to be a bit careful. So this will be 842,400 screws going into awesome sinks, which should in theory give me double that amount in sink points. And you can see it going up. It's obviously very slow because it's screws, they only give 2 points per screw, but it's getting there. It's getting there. So with that done, it was time to work on the next version of how I make screws. Things did get quicker from here, mainly for 2 reasons. One was that I was getting more familiar with how to create the factories and how to use the resources, but also because of the mod that allows for machines of a higher mark level, whereas before I didn't use it quite all the time. So the next way of making screws here is by using the oil to make petroleum coke, which I can then combine with iron ore to make steel, etc, etc. There are also 2 different ways of creating the blueprint. So you either create a blueprint that just deals with the first iteration, and then a blueprint that deals with the second iteration, so on and so forth. The other way, which is what I decided to stick to, was by creating a blueprint that does everything for you. So you just simply feed in the inputs and it does absolutely everything. So I've got oil being made into heavy oil residue, and I'm sinking the polymer resin. I was sinking the polymer resin. I could have combined it with the water to make rubber, which I could then use with the limestone to make concrete, but I was using the quartz, and that was probably the best way for now. And I think I had just about enough quartz to make all of the concrete that I needed. It was a very close number, so yeah, I could have used some of the polymer resin, but it wouldn't have really changed the number by that much at all. So the next stage will be to go around to all of the oil spots in the world and put down these blueprints. You can see the shadow there, that's the highway for, I think, some of the sulfur that I got coming over. I'm currently on the Western Isles using the oil here, and one thing that I realised when I was making these blueprints was that I never created a base of foundations first, and I think the reason for that was because trying to put a blueprint on foundations is much easier than trying to get a blueprint to be in line with a foundation. So I think that's why I did it that way. So I'm getting the oil connected up here. I will need some iron that will need belting in, and I also need some quartz as well. So after getting all of that belted in, I've got all of these ready to go. Got the limestone there, got these different platforms for the oil. The reason I didn't have them all together was because I wanted to try and use the pipes as little as possible, because the fluid physics weren't too great, and I was also using some pipeline Mark V from another mod, so I think that's like 4,800 meters cubed per second, I think is the unit. So I'm just showing the work that I did on the Spire coast, but in total the amount of screws that I made was 321,750 screws in the Western Isles or Western Beaches. In the Spire coast it was 468,000 screws. In the Central Lake it was 62,400. In the swamp there was 31,200. Near the dune there was 87,750. In the blue crater 176,800, and finally near the rocky desert it was 141,235. That was a lot, and I still had plenty of iron ore left over to use for other recipes. So I'm getting all of the iron over to the rocky desert because I was going to use the remainder of the iron with the remainder of the coal, and there'd be a lot of iron left over, and I could then use that to make cast screws from the pure iron recipe. I forgot at this stage that I would need coal to mix with the bauxite to make aluminium beams to make that alternate recipe. What you could also see me do here was create really long belts. That was obviously yet another mod, and I think the mod updated during my time of creating this video, because before there were two different types of belts. There was the normal conveyor belt that I could only make go up to 7 foundations long, and I had to use the flex belt to make it really long, although the flex belt didn't bend properly like the conveyor belt does when it's in the straight build mode. As the game went on, that mod updated, and it then meant that I could put down a conveyor belt, just a normal one, but make it last really long. Sometimes I even did it across near enough the whole of the map, and I could use the straight build mode so it looked a bit nicer as well. Here you can see the work that I put in. That's the rest of the iron being put in, and I can eventually make that into steel ingots with the rest of the coal that I combined just up to the left there. But sadly I had to tear a lot of that down because of the aluminium that I needed to create. I think in total I probably played this for about 100 hours. The in-game timer is slightly off because I could also speed up time if I was travelling long distances, so I think a bit of time could be wasted there. So I reckon I probably wasted about a quarter of that, maybe even a third, by building lots of stuff that I didn't need to. You also might have noticed some belts don't appear to have any items on them, and the reason for that is because of a graphical glitch. I don't know why, just sometimes it appears and sometimes it doesn't. In total there is 12,300 bauxite on the map, so I belted it all over here to the swamp and made this factory at a water level so that the pipes don't need to go up and I wouldn't need to use pumps. Doing it this way meant that it was a lot easier to create the steel beams from the aluminium ingots. I knew that I also had to create bauxite from Samor, but I didn't fully look at that recipe. I thought that the best way of doing it first would be just focus on this, get this done and out of the way with, and then have a look at the SAM ore converter recipe. I did have a bit of a problem with the aluminium, because when you make aluminium you get some water as an output, so the idea would be that you feed it back into the start of the factory, then from the water extractors that you've got you would limit that to be the exact amount extra that you would need. It was only after creating all of this that I figured the best way of doing it is not by putting down all of your factories, then the water extractors and connecting up whatever you need to. It's to create a very small version where you've got just a couple of refineries or so, and then do a water extractor for that. That was the best way of doing it, but I only realised that after putting all of these down. I did, however, use that for the converter recipes, and yeah, it worked so much better. It was only later that I thought about looking for a mod that could sink fluids, and that made it so much easier. I should have had a look to see if there were any mods that allowed you to sink overflow fluids, so like having a smart splitter but for the pipes. That would be really useful. So with the blueprint I got about 600 steel beams being made from it. I think it was 600. So I've got the rows here, and I'm using Mark 5 belts rather than 6 because the 5 belts will handle it, but also there was no lag when placing a Mark 5 belt, whereas with a Mark 6 belt there was, so I didn't really quite get why that was happening, but I thought the less lag the better. So now I'm putting down blueprints that make those steel beams into screws, and this is a blueprint that I had used before, and I just needed to adapt the number of constructors and awesome sinks that there were, just so I had the right number that I needed. I've also used the infinity nudge tool there because trying to put down a massive blueprint, it can be a bit tricky, so it's easier just to get it roughly in the right place and then you just nudge it to wherever you need. So with the bauxite done, it was time to get some more bauxite from mining all of the SAM ore in the world. In total there are 10,200 SAM ore in the world, and the only thing you can do with it is to make it into reanimated SAM, so that would give me 2,550 reanimated SAM. So that's all the SAM ore belted in, and it's just a case of connecting it up to the constructors to make my reanimated SAM. As time went on I had to put more and more signs down as a reminder for exactly how much there was, because the notes on the side started to get a bit full and I didn't want to have to keep alt-tabbing out into a notepad. So the first converter recipe I used was the Petroleum ore converter recipe. That means I get bauxite from that. So in total there's 15,000 Petroleum ore in the world. There wouldn't be anything else I'd be using it with, so I thought, well, let's make it all into bauxite. So I used 1,000 reanimated SAM with the Petroleum to make 12,000 bauxite. Then I used the remaining 1,550 reanimated SAM with the copper, which I think in total is something like 27,900 copper to make 18,600 bauxite. So in total that is 30,600 bauxite. At this stage I didn't realise that that was the amount of bauxite that I was going to make. It's like 2.5 times the amount of bauxite in the world, so I had a lot of work to do. Here is all the bauxite on belts, all 30,600 of it. It took a long time to get this done, and also to try and make it look as uniform as possible. Like I said earlier, it looks like there's no bauxite going onto those belts, but there is. If you hover over it, it does say pick up bauxite. Just a graphical glitch, but if anything it probably made the game run a bit smoother. There you are, you can see it appear back again. Essentially I just have to do the same that I did before, get all of the bauxite belted down, and I can start making it into aluminium. Well, at this stage I started to not worry too much about clipping, so it does kind of go over each other, but I thought, it looks kind of cool, I'll just leave it like that. Besides, I try to avoid clipping as much as possible, and it gets to a point where like you just want to complete the thing. So now I need to get the water put on. These water extractors are Mark IV, so it just means that I just need one of them, and that will sort out all of the water that I need. There was a whole bunch of coal that I had belted over to use in this pure iron area that I just had to disconnect and then reuse for the aluminium that's here. And it was at this stage that I realised I didn't actually have enough coal to be able to complete everything. So this is where, if I had planned it a bit better and I kind of realised how things needed to be planned, then I wouldn't have used all of the coal to make the steel from other places. However, you can use petroleum coke here, so I thought that the best thing to do would be maybe take some from a nearby area. So they're the lakes in the central part of the map. I took some petroleum coke from there and used it to finish off the rest of the bauxite aluminium stuff. Ultimately, you get more steel beams by doing it that way than using the petroleum coke mixing with iron ore to make steel beams. So yes, I lost some screws over there, but it meant I got way more screws over here. So here I was piping the water back on itself as part of the aluminium that you have to do. But there were issues with the physics, with the numbers, and even though I had the numbers correct, something still wasn't right, so I had to try and find a mod to deal with it. Like I said earlier, I've now got the recipe that mixes petroleum coke with alumina solution to make scrap and water. So at least that way I could use the rest of the bauxite and get as many screws as possible from that. I've converted the Central Lakes area so that I'm getting enough petroleum coke to use with the rest of the bauxite. Later on I'll sort out the excess and make that into screws. But weirdly enough, the Central Lakes is the only part of the whole map that isn't in line with the world grid. I think just because of the shape of the lakes, really. And this is the bauxite area, pretty much done, or at least I just need to build the belts. So you can see here I've got all of the sinks, they're just ready to go, and yeah, it's just a case of connecting all of the belts up and get it all made into screws. While I was trying to sort all of that out, it was here that I saw that the refineries weren't running properly because of the water not being put into the right place. So I got that mod there that I was talking about earlier that means that the water can just be sunk, and yeah, definitely one of the best mods ever, because trying to sort out the fluid physics in the pipes is always a pain. It never usually works, so yeah, definitely a highly recommended mod. Anyway, that's all sorted. That's all of the awesome sinks put into place, and I've got everything belted up so that all of this is being processed. Annoyingly, when I was doing a flyby just to try and show things, I realised that I didn't actually use all of the coal, and there's that one belt missing there, which was very frustrating. But I figured that the best thing to do will be to make that into a normal steel factory. So that's what I'm doing here. Yeah, I could have tried to undo what I did before and get some of the petroleum coke back over to the central lake and then adjust the numbers, but it was going to be very small difference, so I thought, you know what, I'll just do it this way. I would just make a pure iron steel place that I can just use the rest of that coal, and you know what, I think it would be maybe a couple of thousand difference. I don't think there really is much in it. So with the bauxite there, making about 1.42 million screws, the last thing to do was to get the remaining iron being made into pure iron ingots and then into cast screws. This would only give me a very small amount of screws, but I had to try and make as many as possible with the resources available. So by this point I had used all of the bauxite, all of the Caterium ore, SAM ore, iron, coal, oil, and I'm sure I've missed a few more. Finally I can place the last sinks, and you can see there it's 1114 iron ingots into screws, you can see the amount of lag that's going on. It was getting really difficult towards the end. And that is the whole thing done. So in total, it should be about 4,223,630 screws that I am sinking. That number might be maybe a tiny bit off, but it's certainly around 4.25 million screws. So here, just doing a flyby, got the pure iron and the reanimated sand bauxite area. You can see up here the huge belt highways that I had to do, and a lot of the resources were just by themselves all over the place. I had to try and get them connected somehow, had to try and make it look as neat as possible. While flying around, I realised that there were a couple of places that weren't operating like they should. So in my reanimated SAM section, I could see that I wasn't getting enough reanimated SAM into these converters. So I had to just double check exactly what was going on, and I realised it because each of these 3 rows isn't producing a nice round number like 1200. I realised that I needed to just divert some of it a little bit more. You can see on the very south side that reanimated SAM is backing up, and on the very north side also getting a bit backed up, so I had to kind of divert a little bit there just so all of it was being filled up. Anyway, with that done and everything moving as it should, it was time to carry on the flyover. So there was just massive highways. It really got quite ridiculous, and I was really glad that I found a way to disable the object counter, because I'm sure it's set to, it's either 2.1 billion or 21 billion, it's something like that. And so if you increase that, then you can build a lot more. It's a bit strange, but anyway, I don't fully understand how that works. Here we have the Spire Coast, got lots of concrete, well, limestone, got quartz coming in to be made into silica, and obviously a lot of iron as well. So yeah, the oil being made into heavy oil residue, being made into petroleum coke. And this is a sort of project where now that I've done it, in theory I could restart it and I know what to do. But oh my god, it was such a long one to do, and yeah, so I probably won't ever do this one again. Anyway, heading over to the Dune Desert, you can see the massive belt highways I've got here because there was a lot of iron. You can see all the miners dotted around. So I definitely needed to use all of the iron, and I got a fair bit of copper from this area as well because it was quite easy just to get that over. So there's a bit of bauxite in this area, so that's what I'm making into the screws there, and then there's a bit of coal left over that I've got. You can see the going across the water there. Got the coal coming over just to help out a bit here, and this was the first bauxite area. So this is normal actual bauxite being made into steel beams. So this is yeah, like I said earlier, about 2.5 times less bauxite than you can create with the reanimated SAM. I did not realise it would be quite that much extra you could create with reanimated SAM. However, obviously I used a lot of Caterium ore and copper that you would need for other things. Like the Caterium ore, you need the quick wire and to make all of that. So yeah, it wouldn't be possible in a normal world, but that's that's part of doing this challenge. And I realised here's another little mistake. I didn't complete this little section when doing the blueprint, so I'm just filling it up. And as I make my way over to the swamp, there's a few resources I've used here. There's a little bit of oil on the south side of the swamp that I've used. It's a really small little thing because it's only, I think, about 900 oil that you can get from there. It's not really much at all. Anyway, got lots of belt highways coming over, going slowly towards the blue crater. Extra foundations that I don't need, so get rid of that so it looks a bit neater. And the blue crater here is where I had the original rubber being created that I was going to use to help make concrete. So I had to get rid of all of that and then rebuild it to make petroleum coke. And then back over to the start, where I was going to plan on having all of my factories over here, and then realised that for the sake of not having any lag, I needed to spread it out. So this one made, I think it was 842,000 screws, something like that. And it was a very big factory for what ended up being not necessarily a huge amount of screws in comparison to the bauxite. So I think the bauxite from just the reanimated SAM made at least 1.5 times more and was definitely a lot easier to make. But if I didn't use all of the extra resources to make the bauxite screws, then I could have easily increased that number. So I suppose it's a case of trying to figure out what the best way of getting the most number of screws would be. So yeah, if I were to do this again, that might be what I do. I focus on the bauxite first and see how much I can get from there. So went over the Western Isles just earlier, and I'm just showing here that I have used all of the resources. So there was raw quartz, SAM ore, sulfur, iron ore, coal, Petroleum, oil and bauxite. That's what I had to use everything of. Limestone as well. That is 4,223,630 screws being made in Satisfactory. Thank you very much for watching that ridiculous challenge. I shall see you in the next video where I do another challenge.